What happens when a corrupt judge thinks she is untouchable? For 22 years, she manipulated justice, deciding the outcome before the trial even began. But today, when she wrongly convicted a young black man, a lawyer stood up to protest. Will the lawyer and the young black man win against the lying judge? Watch until the end and don't forget to like and subscribe. The air inside the Orleans Parish Criminal Court was thick, not with humidity, though New Orleans certainly had its fair share, but with something heavier. A kind of unspoken knowledge that had settled into the courtroom walls over decades. Everyone who stepped through those heavy wooden doors knew how things worked in Judge Olivia Bradshaw's courtroom. She was the undisputed ruler of this space, having sat on the bench for 22 years. In that time, she had built a legacy of fear, control, and unmistakable bias. Not the kind written about in law school textbooks, not the kind that led to disciplinary actions. No, Bradshaw was too careful for that. But the attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew. The defendants knew. The families watching from the gallery knew. They all understood the pattern even if they could never quite prove it, and today that pattern was about to be tested. Marcus Reynolds' polished shoes clicked against the marble floor as he stepped into the courtroom, his presence commanding yet calculated. He had been here before, too many times to count, but today was different. This wasn't just another wrongful conviction case for him. This wasn't just about fighting for his client's freedom. Today, he wasn't just another black attorney trying to argue against a system built to shut him down. Today, he was here to change the game. Marcus was 48 years old, a man who had built his reputation on taking the cases no one else wanted. The ones that other defense attorneys wouldn't touch because they knew what it meant, fighting a losing battle against a rigged system. He had made a career out of exposing the cracks in that system, piece by piece. But in front of him sat the one immovable object that had outlasted every battle he had fought in this city's courtrooms, Judge Olivia Bradshaw. Bradshaw sat behind the massive bench, her expression unreadable, but Marcus knew that look well. She had perfected it over decades, that carefully calculated mixture of disinterest and quiet authority. The reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, the thin smirk barely concealed behind pursed lips. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. Her power wasn't in her volume, but in the way she cut down attorneys with a single glance, the way her rulings always seemed to lean a certain way. Not enough for an appeal, not enough for a scandal, but enough that everyone in this room knew. The only thing different today. For the first time in 22 years, she was about to face someone who wasn't just here to survive her courtroom. He was here to take her down. Jamal Carter, a 29-year-old construction worker, sat quietly at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked tired, worn down, not just from this case but from the system itself. He had been arrested 3 months ago, accused of an armed robbery he swore he didn't commit. The evidence against him, flimsy at best, a grainy security camera image that could have been any black man in the city, a witness statement from a nervous store clerk who had changed his story twice before settling on, "I think it was him." And yet, here Jamal sat, facing 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Because in Bradshaw's courtroom, reasonable doubt didn't apply if you were a black man. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Richard Vaughn sat too comfortably in his seat, flipping through his neatly organized case file with the arrogance of a man who knew he had already won. Vaughn was young, overconfident, and dangerously ambitious. Fresh out of law school, he had latched onto Judge Bradshaw's favoritism like a lifeline, and she had rewarded him well. She groomed prosecutors like him, guiding them through cases, correcting their missteps, and when necessary, tilting the scales in their favor. Vaughn knew this case was weak. He knew Marcus Reynolds was a stronger attorney than he could ever hope to be. But he didn't care. Because he didn't have to win on his own merits, Bradshaw would make sure he won no matter what. And so, as Marcus took his seat beside his client, Vaughn smirked slightly, like a kid who had been given the answers to the test before it even started. Judge Bradshaw glanced over her glasses, tapping her gavel lightly against the bench. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, barely looking at him. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." Marcus didn't react. He had expected something like this. "I'll try not to, Your Honor." A slight smirk flickered across Bradshaw's lips, but it wasn't amusement. It was control. She turned toward Vaughn. "Mr. Vaughn, is the prosecution ready?" Vaughn straightened in his chair, throwing a quick glance toward Marcus, as if sizing him up before speaking. "We are, Your Honor." Of course they were ready. They were always ready when the deck was stacked against a black man. Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about Jamal. This was about every black man who had ever walked into this courtroom, already condemned before the first word was spoken. And Marcus wasn't leaving here today without making damn sure everyone saw it for what it was. The trial started, but it wasn't a trial. It was a performance. And Bradshaw was the star of the show. Every objection Marcus raised, overruled. Every legal slip-up Vaughn made, corrected. Every glance Marcus threw at the jury, noted and countered by Bradshaw's carefully chosen words, but Marcus wasn't fighting for Bradshaw's approval. He was watching, listening, calculating. Because the thing about people who think they are untouchable is that they always make mistakes. And today, Marcus was going to make sure Bradshaw made the biggest mistake of her career. He leaned in slightly toward Jamal, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "Hold on, Jamal," he murmured. "This isn't over." Jamal nodded slowly, gripping the table as the first witness was called to the stand. The game had begun. And this time, Marcus Reynolds was playing for keeps. The courtroom had settled into an uneasy rhythm, one that Marcus Reynolds knew all too well. It was a dance orchestrated by Judge Olivia Bradshaw, where every move was choreographed to favor the prosecution. The moment the trial officially began, the imbalance of power became undeniable. Marcus raised his first objection within minutes, a simple challenge to the prosecution's vague questioning, and Bradshaw barely let him finish before responding. "Overruled," she said, not even looking up from her notes. Marcus didn't react. He simply leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with deliberate ease. He expected this. The real battle hadn't even begun yet. The prosecution's star witness, Walter Green, shuffled to the stand, looking uncomfortable. Walter was in his late 60s, a frail man with sunken cheeks and nervous eyes. He had owned Green's convenience store for over 30 years, and it was his store that had been robbed the night Jamal Carter was arrested. Richard Vaughn, the young prosecutor, walked toward the witness stand with too much confidence for a man who barely knew what he was doing. "Mr. Green," Vaughn said, smiling as if they were old friends, "can you confirm for the jury that the defendant, Jamal Carter, was the man you saw at your store that night?" Walter hesitated. It was subtle, but Marcus saw it. The older man licked his lips, his fingers tightening around the edge of the witness stand. He cast a quick glance toward Judge Bradshaw, as if waiting for permission to speak. That was all Marcus needed to see. Walter was scared. He wasn't lying outright, but he wasn't sure either. Still, the pressure in the room was unbearable, and finally, Walter swallowed hard and gave the answer everyone expected. I think so." Marcus was on his feet before Walter could say another word. "Objection, Your Honor." His voice was steady, professional, but the weight behind his words was impossible to ignore. "I think so" is not a definitive identification. Judge Bradshaw sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose like she was already tired of dealing with him. "Overruled," she said flatly. "The witness has answered." Marcus exhaled slowly, giving a slight shake of his head, making sure the jury saw it. It was just subtle enough, just enough to plant doubt in their minds. He sat back down, but he wasn't done yet. When Vaughn finished stumbling through a few more leading questions, it was Marcus's turn. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit jacket as he approached the witness stand. Every movement was deliberate, calm, measured. He stopped just a few feet away from Walter Green and locked eyes with him. "Mr. Green," Marcus began, his voice smooth but firm. "You said you think you saw my client that night. Just to clarify, are you absolutely certain it was Jamal Carter?" Walter visibly tensed. His fingers twitched against the witness stand. "I mean," Walter hesitated, glancing toward Vaughn, then toward Bradshaw. "I thought I saw him, but..." Before he could finish, Judge Bradshaw cut in. "Move on, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her tone sharper now. Marcus turned his head slowly, meeting her gaze. "Your Honor," he said, keeping his voice neutral, "I'd like the witness to finish his statement." Bradshaw's expression barely flickered. "I said move on." A heavy silence settled over the room. Marcus didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Instead, he spoke with precision. "For the record, Your Honor, you are preventing the witness from clarifying his own testimony." Bradshaw's jaw clenched just slightly. "I'm warning you, Mr. Reynolds." Marcus let the moment stretch, holding her gaze just long enough for the jury to understand what was happening. Then, finally, he turned back to Walter Green. "No further questions." He walked back to the defense table slowly, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Marcus knew how this worked. Bradshaw was so used to controlling the courtroom without question, so used to pushing defense attorneys aside, that she didn't even realize she was exposing herself. She had just denied a witness the chance to clarify a statement that could have helped the defense, and everyone saw it. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. The reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads saw it. This wasn't just bias. This was deliberate obstruction. Now it was time for the real move. Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, flipping through them with calculated ease before holding one up. "Your Honor," he said, "the prosecution failed to disclose a key piece of evidence during discovery, in direct violation of Brady v. Maryland." Judge Bradshaw's bored expression didn't change. "Denied," she said before he even finished. A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery. Marcus didn't react immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, giving everyone in the room time to process what just happened. Then he spoke again. "Just to be clear, Your Honor, you are refusing to acknowledge a Brady violation." Bradshaw's lips thinned, her irritation flashing across her face for just a second too long. "I said denied, Mr. Reynolds." This time, the whispers grew louder. Marcus could feel it, the jury shifting in their seats. The reporters writing faster. Even Vaughn was suddenly less confident, fidgeting at the prosecution table. Bradshaw had just made a crucial mistake, and she didn't even realize it yet. He glanced at his client, Jamal Carter, whose hands were clenched into fists beneath the table. Jamal muttered under his breath, barely audible, "Man, don't let her do this to me." Marcus didn't look at him. He didn't need to. "I have nothing further, Your Honor." He sat down smoothly, keeping his expression neutral. Judge Bradshaw scoffed, acting as if she had won this round, but she hadn't won anything. Because this wasn't about winning objections. This was about forcing her into the open, about letting her expose herself. And now, with the jury, the reporters, and even some of the court officials watching closely, Marcus knew one thing for certain. Bradshaw had just taken the bait. The trap was set, and she was walking right into it. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was subtle at first, a tension just beneath the surface, a feeling that something was about to crack. Judge Olivia Bradshaw sat at the bench, her gavel resting easily in her hand, the weight of her authority pressing down on every person in the room. She believed she was untouchable. 22 years of ruling this courtroom, of shaping verdicts, of guiding trials to fit her version of justice. Today was no different. She had dismissed Marcus Reynolds at every turn, had denied every objection without hesitation. She had forced a witness into an identification, had ignored a blatant Brady violation, and still she felt confident. She had won, or so she thought. Then the doors of the courtroom burst open. The sound was sharp, final, like the gavel she so often slammed down to silence dissent. Every head in the room turned as two men in dark suits strode inside, their movements crisp, purposeful. Marcus Reynolds didn't react. He simply smoothed out his tie and folded his hands neatly on the defense table. Bradshaw, on the other hand, tensed. It was just a flicker of movement, the kind of instinctive reaction a person has when they sense danger but haven't yet figured out what it is. Her eyes narrowed as the first agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a clipped professional demeanor, flashed a badge. "Judge Olivia Bradshaw," he said, his voice cutting through the thick silence like a blade. "You are under arrest for bribery, obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and multiple civil rights violations." The entire room froze. A ripple of gasps swept through the gallery. The jury sat frozen, their eyes bouncing between the agents and the judge. Richard Vaughn, the young prosecutor, paled instantly, his hands gripping the edges of his notes like a drowning man clinging to a life raft. A reporter at the front nearly dropped her pen, scrambling to flip the page in her notebook. Even Jamal Carter, the defendant who had been fighting for his life just moments ago, sat with his mouth slightly open as if he wasn't sure if he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how things worked. Judge Bradshaw was the system. She was the authority. And yet, here she was, the defendant now. Judge Bradshaw's jaw tightened. She squared her shoulders, forced her voice into a cold, sharp tone. "I am in the middle of a trial," she said, her gaze locking onto the agents as if her authority still mattered. "Whatever this is, it can wait." The lead agent didn't flinch. "This is a matter of federal interest, Judge," he said. "It cannot wait." A fresh wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. Marcus remained still, watching as Bradshaw's carefully built wall of control started to show cracks. Her hands tightened around her gavel, but she didn't slam it down. She couldn't. For the first time in 22 years, her power didn't mean anything. Bradshaw turned sharply to Richard Vaughn, her so-called protege. "Mr. Vaughn, should we take a recess?" Her voice had a razor's edge to it, but beneath it, there was something else, something dangerously close to fear. Vaughn, still gripping his notes like a lifeline, looked between her and the agents, completely lost. He had spent his whole career under her protection. Without her, he was nothing. He cleared his throat, voice weak. Maybe, Your Honor," Bradshaw seethed. Her gaze snapped back to the agents. "This is outrageous." The second agent stepped forward, this time addressing the courtroom at large. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Judge Bradshaw." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then the jury shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a middle-aged black woman who had been watching the trial with quiet disapproval, let out a breath of disbelief. Bradshaw finally turned toward Marcus Reynolds, and for the first time, she truly saw him. Not just another attorney standing before her, not just another name on the docket. She saw the man who had been waiting for this moment. Her lips curled, her voice dropping into a furious whisper. "This was your doing." Marcus stood. He smoothed out his suit jacket, his face unreadable, his tone calm. "No," he said, his voice even. "This is justice." One of the agents pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket and began reading the charges aloud. "Olivia Bradshaw, you are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent." The words drowned out under the murmurs in the gallery. Bradshaw's face drained of color. She turned toward the court officer, a man who had worked under her for years, someone who had once stood at attention whenever she entered the room. But today, that same officer walked toward her, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The final blow. Her fingers curled into fists, but she didn't resist. She couldn't. When the cold metal snapped around her wrists, the room wasn't just watching. They were witnessing. A reckoning. For 22 years, Bradshaw had ruled this courtroom like a monarch. Today, she left it as a prisoner. The agents led her toward the doors, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the floor, but this time, they weren't a symbol of authority. This time, they sounded like a woman marching toward her own downfall. The court officer, someone who had once followed her orders without question, held the door open for her. She hesitated, then stepped through. The doors slammed shut behind her, and just like that she was gone. The room remained frozen, the enormity of what had just happened sinking in. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus let out a slow breath, letting his hands rest on the defense table. Across from him, Jamal Carter finally moved, shaking his head in stunned disbelief. "Man," he muttered, "I thought people like her never paid for what they did." Marcus glanced at the empty judge's bench, his expression unreadable. "They do." But the real lesson, that was still to come. Because this wasn't just about Judge Bradshaw. This was about every case she had ever ruled on, every innocent man she had sent away, every bribe she had taken, every biased judgment she had passed. This was just the beginning. Marcus had won today, but tomorrow he had work to do. The courtroom was still buzzing with shock, the aftershocks of Judge Olivia Bradshaw's arrest rippling through every person in the room. The air, once thick with the weight of her authority, now felt lighter, as if a storm had passed. But the damage she had done remained, and Marcus Reynolds knew exactly what he had to do next. He stood slowly, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders, but he didn't allow himself to feel relief. Not yet. Jamal Carter was still in handcuffs, and until those cuffs were removed, this wasn't over. As the murmurs in the gallery rose to a low hum, Marcus turned toward the courtroom bailiff and spoke in a firm, clear voice. "Who's the presiding judge now?" The bailiff, a heavy-set man who had once followed Bradshaw's every order without hesitation, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at the empty bench, then at Marcus, as if unsure of what to do without Bradshaw calling the shots. Finally, he cleared his throat and muttered, "Judge Mitchell is next in line." Marcus nodded once. Jonathan Mitchell. The name was familiar, an older, fair-minded judge, known for his integrity and measured rulings. He wasn't a man who sought attention or power, but he believed in the law as it was meant to be, not as Bradshaw had twisted it to serve her own interests. And now, he was about to take the most important case of his career. The doors swung open again, but this time, there was no tension, only anticipation. Judge Jonathan Mitchell walked in, a black man in his late 60s, with graying hair and a sharp gaze that took in everything at once. Unlike Bradshaw, he didn't radiate arrogance or intimidation. He carried the quiet weight of responsibility. He stepped up to the bench and took a slow breath, assessing the courtroom that had just witnessed the unthinkable. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, steady, and laced with authority. "Court is back in session." The room settled, all eyes turning toward Marcus. This was his moment. Marcus took a single step forward, his stance unshakable. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Jamal Carter, on the grounds that this entire trial was tainted from the start." Judge Mitchell studied him, his fingers interlacing as he listened. Marcus continued, his words sharp, deliberate, and undeniable. "Judge Bradshaw's arrest proves what we already knew. This trial was never fair. She had already decided its outcome before the first piece of evidence was presented. Every ruling she made, every objection she overruled, was part of her pattern of corruption. My client was never given a chance at justice." He paused for just a beat, letting the weight of his words sink in. Now that the corrupt judge is in handcuffs, the only just action is to undo her damage. The gallery held its breath. Even Richard Vaughn, the once arrogant prosecutor, had lost all confidence, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if he were waiting to see whether his career would collapse next. Judge Mitchell leaned back slightly, his gaze unwavering as he processed everything before him. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I agree." The words rang through the courtroom like a gavel strike. A wave of stunned murmurs erupted through the gallery. Even some of the jurors exchanged glances, as if they had just witnessed something historic. Judge Mitchell turned to the bailiff. "Remove his restraints." For a second, no one moved. Then the courtroom officer stepped forward, unlocking Jamal Carter's handcuffs. The moment the metal fell away from his wrists, Jamal let out a breath he had been holding for months. He stared at his freed hands, flexing his fingers as if he couldn't quite believe they were really his again. Marcus saw the tears well up in his eyes, but Jamal blinked them back, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to stay grounded in the moment. Judge Mitchell nodded once. "Mr. Carter, you are free to go." For a long moment, Jamal didn't move. Then slowly he pushed back his chair and stood, and for the first time in months he wasn't a prisoner anymore. The gallery erupted in hushed conversations, a mix of disbelief, relief, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, the words "judge arrested in her own courtroom" already beginning to take shape in their headlines. Even the jury, who had been helpless bystanders in Bradshaw's game, seemed to breathe a little easier. And then there was Richard Vaughn. The once smug prosecutor sat completely still, staring at his notes as if the weight of everything Bradshaw had done, everything he had been complicit in, was finally settling on his shoulders. Marcus didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Vaughn had backed the wrong side of history, and now he was realizing just how alone he was. Jamal turned to Marcus, his voice low and filled with something indescribable. "I don't even know what to say." Marcus clapped a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm. "You don't have to say anything." He gave a small nod toward the doors. "Just walk out of here." Jamal swallowed hard and took his first step toward the exit. The gallery watched him go, and as he passed the jury box, a woman who had been watching the trial with a critical eye gave him a small, approving nod. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, because for the first time since this nightmare began, he was free. As the doors closed behind Jamal, Marcus didn't move. He stared at the empty judge's bench, his hands clasped together. Judge Bradshaw was gone, but her ruling still stood. How many other men had been sentenced unfairly in her courtroom? How many families had been destroyed because of her corruption? Jamal Carter had won today, but Marcus knew this was just one battle. The war was still raging. And he wasn't done yet. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Jamal Carter, sealing behind him the nightmare he had been trapped in for months. He was free. And yet Marcus Reynolds didn't move. He stood near the defense table, his eyes fixed on the empty judge's bench, where Olivia Bradshaw once sat, unchallenged, unshaken, untouchable. But now she was gone. For the first time in 22 years, that seat was vacant, no longer ruled by prejudice, power, and corruption. No longer a throne for injustice masquerading as the law. But the absence of one corrupt judge didn't erase the damage she had done, and Marcus knew it. The courtroom was quiet now, but it wasn't the tense silence that had loomed over them hours earlier. This was different. This was the silence of change. The kind of quiet that followed an earthquake when the dust had yet to settle, but the foundation had already cracked beyond repair. The jury members still sat in their seats, some wide-eyed, others deep in thought, as if they were processing everything they had just witnessed. Judge Olivia Bradshaw arrested in her own courtroom. A headline that would be all over the news within the hour. Reporters scrambled to pack up their notes, exchanging glances that said more than their hurried words ever could. Richard Vaughn, the young prosecutor who had once oozed arrogance, was ghostly pale. His hands still gripped his files, but he hadn't turned a single page in minutes. He wasn't just shell-shocked by Bradshaw's arrest. He was terrified by what it meant for him. Marcus finally turned, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in the weight of the moment. It was a victory, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Jamal stood near the exit, hesitating for just a moment before turning back toward Marcus. His hands, now unshackled, flexed as if he were still getting used to the feeling of freedom. No metal restraints, no courtroom suffocating him, no false accusations weighing on his chest. Just air, space, a future. He took a slow breath, shaking his head in awe. "Man," his voice was low, almost like he didn't believe it yet. "I thought this day would never come." Marcus studied him, seeing not just a man who had been freed, but a man who had nearly been swallowed whole by a broken system. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so that only Jamal could hear him. "Today you walk free, but there are still many more out there who remain trapped in this system." Jamal swallowed hard, nodding once. He didn't need to say anything, his gratitude was written all over his face, but he also understood the weight of what Marcus was saying. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. As Jamal turned toward the doors, stepping out of the life that almost destroyed him, Marcus exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the fight still ahead. Bradshaw was gone, but the system that had protected her for decades, that system was still standing. How many men had sat where Jamal sat, wrongfully convicted by a judge who had already decided their fate before the trial even began? How many families had wept in these very benches, watching their sons, brothers, fathers be taken away for crimes they never committed? Bradshaw had been one judge in one courtroom, but there were others. There would always be others, unless someone stood up to them. He turned away from the empty bench and began walking toward the exit, his steps steady, his mind already moving to what came next. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. His next steps wouldn't be in a courtroom. They'd be in files, case reviews, investigations, digging into every wrongful conviction Judge Bradshaw had ever handed down. Because she hadn't just sent innocent men to prison. She had taken lives, families, futures. Marcus wasn't done until every one of them had their day in court, until every single case she had corrupted was overturned, until the system itself was forced to answer for what it had allowed to happen. Marcus stepped out of the courthouse, the evening air cool against his skin, the city buzzing around him like any other day. For the world outside, nothing had changed. New Orleans still moved at its own rhythm. People still walked past the courthouse without realizing justice had just shifted inside those walls. But for those inside, for those who had watched power finally crumble, nothing would ever be the same. Marcus closed his eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. Then he let it go. One fight was over, but the war, that was just getting started. The story ends, but the fight for justice has only just begun.